Good afternoon, everyone. His Excellency Salim Amir Al-Shamsi charged the affairs ad interim of the UAE Embassy in Singapore. Dr. Brian Shegar, President of the UAE Singapore Business Council. Mr. Moy Salim, Exco member of the UAESBC and COO of Emirates National Oil Company Singapore Private Limited. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Huzaria Hussain from ENOC, representing the organizer UAE Singapore Business Council, or better known as the UAESBC. It is indeed a great pleasure to welcome you to the 9th presentation of the UAESBC Quarterly Talks series. The series aims to edify and educate audiences on pertinent topics of interest delivered by experts or prominent figures in their respective fields. Before we start off, let me first share with you the outline of our program that is being displayed now. To begin today's event, I now have the pleasure to invite our guest of honor to give the opening speech, to charge the affairs ad interim of the UAE Embassy in Singapore, His Excellency Salim Amir Al-Shamsi. Your Excellency, please.
Yes, President of UAE Singapore Business Council, Dr. Brian Shegar, and Executive Committee members, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a pleasure to present this afternoon on behalf of the UAE Embassy to give you a short welcome address to the UAE Singapore Business Council Quarterly Talk. The UAE Singapore Business Council has done a great job in establishing itself as a dynamic and productive business organization with the aim of promoting greater connectivity between the UAE and Singapore, in the line with the Singapore-UAE Comprehensive Partnership. The UAE Singapore Business Council was specially mentioned in the joint declaration as the platform for enhancing B2B connectivity. It has fulfilled this role in many ways, such as organizing investment workshops in conjunction with the other strategic partners, chambers of commerce, and trade associations. Organization trade missions in the UAE jointly with the other business grouping, and organizing regular talk, inviting diplomats, prominent businessmen, economists, and experts to share their wisdom and experience with the members and the broader audience. The UAE Embassy, as a strategic partner of the UAE Singapore Business Council, is happy to work closely with the UAE Singapore Business Council and the other stakeholders to achieve the objectives of the Business Council. I am delighted that Dr. Brian Shegar, President of the UAE Singapore Business Council, is delivering today's talk, a topic that it is significant relevant in being able to drive the most meaningful and insightful understanding of the Middle East. I'm sure you will agree that Dr. Brian Shegar, with his wealth of experience, is the most qualified to render this talk, and thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon to all of you. Dr. Brian Shegar's illustrious career spans over 40 years of leadership in international banking experience, with focus on Southeast and South Asia, Asia Pacific, and Middle East. He has successfully established and led the operations of Midland, Nedbank, and Emirates NBD in various locations in the Asia Pacific region, including Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Australia. Brian's involvement in the GCC region began in 2006 when he established and ran one of the top banks in the Middle East, Emirates NBD, in Asia Pacific, including the regional branch in Singapore and representative offices in China and Jakarta. After his retirement from Emirates NBD in 2018, Brian has established Middle East Asia Consultancy Pte Limited. This is basically to assist Singapore and Asian companies in their business development aspirations in UAE and Middle East. That same year, 2018, he was instrumental in establishing the UAE Singapore Business Council to promote greater business connectivity between UAE and Singapore. And he was also elected president of this body. Brian is also a member of the Global Advisory Board of the CAS Business School, covering UAE and Singapore, member of the Editorial Advisory Board of the Journal of Gulf Economics, Trade and Finance, and a past honorary fellow of the NUS Middle East Institute. Brian holds a BSc Honours degree in Banking and International Finance, and also an MSc Finance from CAS Business School of City, University of London. He also has a doctorate in Business Administration from the University of Western Australia Business School. Further, Brian has also presented several papers and spoken at numerous seminars and conferences. So as we can see, we indeed today have the privilege of hearing from a very knowledgeable and illustrious personality and a dear friend of mine, Dr. Brian. Over to you, Doctor.
His Excellency Salim Al-Shamsi, Charge d'Affaires at Interim of the UAE Embassy in Singapore, Excellencies, fellow EXCO members, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Mois, for your kind introduction. And indeed, it is a pleasure for me to be with you this afternoon to present this talk, which I title Understanding the Middle East, a Holistic Approach. I must confess, I'm not a scholar, historian, or academic. I'm a banker. I'm an international banker. And as Moises explained in his introduction, I had the good fortune of setting up and running a Middle Eastern bank. Now, when you're a CEO of a bank from the Middle East, it is imperative that you have to understand the background of the region from which your bank originates. So that's what I did. I went into a deep dive to understand the background of this region. And what an amazing story. The cradle of two of the oldest civilizations in the world, the center of three Abrahamic faiths, the crossroads of East and West. Indeed, it is a story to be told. What I did is, when I put all these things together, when I read from various sources, I presented a workshop at the RSIS NTU for master's students in international studies. It was a one-day workshop, and I was then persuaded to present in a very, very summarized, distilled manner that workshop within 40 minutes or 45 minutes, which I will aspire to do. Therefore, I must say at the outset, I'm just skimming the surface. And I hope I do justice to this topic. Why do I call it holistic? Because what I'm going to do over the next 40 minutes is to present through various lenses the complexity, the multidimensionality of that region, which covers history, ethnicity, the various denominations, a little bit on the main countries that are relevant to Singapore, on economics, some of the challenges. And I hope that by the end of this presentation, you will have a broad but holistic understanding of this very important region. Now, I call the next part an introduction to nomenclature because I want you to understand what the various terms that I use often mean to describe the region. The Middle East itself. It was coined by the British Foreign Service, and it took over a previous term called West Asia. The Middle East comprises a number of countries, and the consensus is the countries that are defined as the part of the Middle East are Bahrain, Egypt, Iran, Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Israel, Lebanon, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Yemen, Syria, and the Palestinian territories. But you would have also have heard the term MENA often, because MENA is not just the Middle East, but tagged on is North Africa, particularly the North African countries of Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. Now, these are Arabic countries which are culturally and religiously linked to the core Middle Eastern countries. Now, 20% of the Muslim population are Arabic speaking. You would also have heard of the word Levant. And this is a French word arising from the Italian word Levante. It means rising. In Arabic, it's al-Mashriq, or the land where the sun rises. And in the old days, during the time of the Ottomans, the British had the Levant Company, which was set up to monopolize trade with the Ottoman Empire. And the French had a campaign, Du Levant, which was similarly set up for the same purpose. In a broad sense, the Levant includes the countries in the Eastern Mediterranean: Cyprus, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and the Western Sinai. You would have heard the word Maghreb. Now, in Maghreb means the West in Arabic, and that means where the sun sets. And these are the countries in Northwest Africa, namely Algeria, Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, and Mauritania. You would obviously be well aware of the GCC, a very important grouping of some of the wealthiest countries in the Middle East. The Gulf Cooperation Council, established in 1981 by Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar, headquartered in Riyadh. This region has 50% of the world's oil reserves and of very, very important relevance in the world's energy scene. Of course, now they are trying to diversify away from oil to other sectors like manufacturing and tourism and services, but it is a major oil producing region, and gas as well. The Arab League was set up in 1949-45 and was founded in Cairo with 22 member states, formally recognized as part of the Arab diaspora. I want to now talk about history. Now, the history of the Middle East is like the history of China, the history of India. It is a long story, and it has three parts to it, which I want to cover. There seems to be an echo for some reason. Can I get some assistance, Uda? Okay. Now, the first part is what I call pre-Islamic history. The second is Islamic. And the third part I consider modern history. Now, let me now talk about pre-Islamic history. As I said, it is an ancient region that goes back 5,000 years. And the oldest civilization in the world, the Sumerian civilization, started there, 4,500 BC. It was founded between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And the Greeks gave it the name Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. The ancient Sumerian civilization led to some very famous empires that some of us would have read in our history books when we were young. Akkadians, first of all, the Syrians,
the Babylonians, the Neo-Babylonian empires. These were great empires. It had great figures like Sargon, the great king Sargon, Hammurabi in the court of Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar, who built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the ancient wonders of the world. And we, in all history books, know these to be some of the most successful empires in the early days of the Middle East. Of course, Egypt, the Egyptian civilization, is another ancient civilization contemporaneous with Sumeria. It started around 3150 BC with the political unification of Lower and Upper Egypt. And they had tremendous advanced knowledge of astronomy, building science, agriculture, medicine, etc. These monuments are still there for us to see, the pyramids, the Temple of Karnak, and other great, the Temple of Abu Simbel. The Egyptians were master builders. A lot of people forget about Phoenicia. Phoenicia was another ancient civilization that was also contemporaneous between at the time of the Egyptian and Sumerian civilization, and they were traders. They traded between the Sumerians and the Egyptians, but they also set up trading colonies along the Mediterranean coastline. And these colonies evolved and became later on the Carthaginian Empire. Of course, the Persians. They started around 550 BC by the Achaemenids, established by the great Cyrus the king, who was famous because he released all the Hebrew slaves who were enslaved by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon and let them go back to Jerusalem. Followed by the Parthians. The Parthians were the northern part of Egypt. And after the invasion by Alexander the Great, the Seleucids, also known as the RSIS. And afterwards, the mighty Sasanian Zoroastrian Empire, which coexisted with the Byzantine Empire. So here you have some maps. You've got Egypt there, around the River Nile, the fertile River Nile, the delta and the river itself. And the second picture shows the extent of the commercial network of the Phoenicians. Were great sailors, traders, and then on the right, Sumeria. You can see the two rivers, Euphrates and Tigris, and the fertile valley and region around it. And in the bottom two maps refer to the early Persian Empire and the Sasanian dynasty at the tail end of the Persian Empire before the Arab conquest. Now, I want to talk about some very interesting external influences. First of all, the Greeks. The Hellenistic period in the Middle East started, of course, with the invasion of Alexander the Great. And as you can see from this map, he went all the way as far as India. He died prematurely, but his empire was divided into different regions. And one of the important regions, one of the important sort of dynasties that arose from the breakup of the empire was the Ptolemaic dynasty that controlled northern Egypt, with Alexandria as the capital. And you all remember the great lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the another great wonders of the world. And some of you may remember Cleopatra. Now, Cleopatra was the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty. They were destroyed by the Romans. The Romans came and they expanded into the Middle East. And they were very fortunate because they found Egypt. And Egypt became the richest province in the mighty Roman Empire, and was the breadbasket, you could say, of the whole empire. Christianity later on took root as well, and Alexandria and Edessa became great centers of Christian scholarship. Now, when the Western Roman Empire sort of started fading away around 450 AD, the Byzantium or Eastern Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years. So in the second map, you see the extent of the whole Roman Empire at the peak in 117 AD, and then the map below depicts the Byzantium Empire, and they flourished for 1,000 years and coexisted with the other powers in the Middle East. But they had, their base was the Greek culture, the Greek language. Now I want to talk about the Islamic period, starting with the Rashidun Caliphate, which was from 632 AD to 661. This was founded by the Prophet Muhammad himself, who founded the religion, founded Islam, and united the tribes of Arabia under one polity. Subsequently, Abu Bakr took over as the caliph, then Omar, then Uthman, and then Ali. During this period, there was tremendous territorial expansion, as you can see from that map there, how quickly the Arabic conquest overwhelmed a tremendous amount of territory, including the Persians, mighty Persian Empire. However, after the death of Ali, there was a civil war between the descendants of Ali and a group led by Muawiyah, who believed that the caliph need not necessarily be a descendant of the Prophet. And subsequently, as a result of that, the Umayyad Caliphate was established between 661 to 750 AD, and the caliph ruled out of Damascus, current the capital of Syria. And again, the Arabic Empire grew even further. They conquered even more territory. But they also did a few other things. They introduced Muslim coinage. They established Arabic as the official language. Now they created a stable administration that followed the Byzantine structures. But even the Byzantine Empire copied it from the Persian Empire, the satraps. So one of the reasons why the Arabic conquest was so successful is the Arabs were clever to leverage the existing administrative structures that was there. That's how they very easily capitalized on what was already there in terms of structures. I have to mention the Moorish Caliphate, which was a sub-caliphate of the Umayyad Caliphate, which continued in Spain as Al-Andalus until 1492, a good 800 years. And that was one of the golden ages of Islam. And a lot of people do not know this, but it's also one of the golden ages of Jewish culture. Because when the Jews were in a way evacuated from Judea by the Romans, many of them found refuge in Spain under the rule of the Moorish, under the benign rule and the very enlightened rule of the Moorish caliphs. Let me move on to the subsequent caliphate. So the Umayyads continued as a sub-dynasty in Iberia or Spain, but in the Middle East, they were taken over by the Abbasids, the third Islamic caliphate, established by Abbas, was related to Abu Bakr, that's the caliph who followed the Prophet Muhammad, but they moved the capital to Baghdad. And the Abbasid Caliphate was also a golden age for Islam. And there were a number of very enlightened caliphs, but the one who is most recognized is Harun al-Rashid. Prime Minister Mahathir always quoted Harun al-Rashid as one of the most enlightened rulers in Islam, in the Islamic history, because he established the house of knowledge, the Bayat al-Hikmah, and he invited scholars from all over the world, particularly the East, and they translated ancient works of the East and also Rome and Greek into Arabic and Persian languages, which later were translated into Turkish, Hebrew, and Latin. This time, during this period, there were great scholars who are recognized even now. Scientists like Al-Hazan, who discovered optics, Ibn Sina or Avicenna, who wrote many canons on medicine, Al-Batani was a great astronomer, and Al-Khwarizmi, who was a mathematician and a founder of algebra. His book was called Algebra, and so that's how algebra came. The Abbasids ruled, and the Mongols destroyed them. And you know how difficult it was to meet the onslaught of a Mongol conquest. and Hulagu, who was the grandson, I think, of Genghis Khan, completely devastated Baghdad, one of the greatest tragedies in the world, and depopulated Baghdad, which was at that time one of the greatest cities in the world. But during the Abbasids, there were some smaller dynasties, like the Fatimids were a Ismaili kingdom out of Cairo, and the Ayyubids, the Mamluks, which were descendants of slaves, who were all ultimately overthrown by the Ottomans in 1517. Now I go to the mighty Ottoman Empire, which ruled from 1037 to 1923. They took over from the Seljuk Turks, and they were founded by Osman I. Under the great Mehmed the Conqueror, they reorganized the state, became very structured, very organized, very efficient, and they managed to conquer supposedly the unconquerable, impregnable city of Constantinople, where the Byzantium Empire had shrunk to just Constantinople. And finally, that was the death knell of course, the Byzantium Empire, when Constantinople was conquered by the Ottomans in 1453. Subsequently, the empire flourished and expanded economically, also because of its control of the major overland trade routes between Europe and Asia, the Silk Roads. You go to Istanbul, you can still see the bazaar, which still exists. And under Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire conquered vast amount of territory, spanning 3 continents, and controlled most of the Mediterranean Sea, and also became part of the European political scene. But they were met and defeated by the Austro-Hungarians at a place called Zenta in Serbia, and then they had to sign a treaty, the Treaty of Karlowitz, which was quite a punitive treaty because it gave the European powers a lot of economic and trade benefits in the Ottoman Empire, which actually went to affect the Ottoman Empire very severely in an economic sense. But it also limited the expansion of the Ottomans in Europe. And so the economy deteriorated. It's a big empire as well, difficult to rule. So by mid-18th century, Turkey was known as the sick man of Europe. And the European powers were getting more emergent, more powerful. They had more modern military, more modern structures, and they were continuously engaged in a power struggle to safeguard their military, strategic, and commercial interests, of course, at the expense of the Ottomans. So the Germans in 1883 started developing good links with the Ottoman, helped sort of build their army up, and that led to the Ottomans making this fatal mistake of joining Germany in World War I in 1914, which led to their subsequent defeat and breakup. Here you have a map of the Ottoman Empire. You will see they were nearly on the verge of conquering Vienna, but they were stopped there. It was a huge empire, again, ruled in a very decentralized manner. I want to go on to the modern history of the region, and I want to briefly cover the impact of First World War. As I told you, the Ottoman Empire lost not only the war, but they lost the whole empire. But there was a secret deal, a notoriously secret deal, because if you look at history, this is one of the most notorious events that happened. The French and the British signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, basically dividing the Middle East into areas under French and British control. For example, Transjordan, Palestine, Mesopotamia came under British influence. Syria, Lebanon came under French influence. Now, Arabs were terribly disappointed because Arabs helped the British to, in a way, launch an uprising around the Arabian Peninsula against the Ottomans, of course. And they were promised some kind of a homeland called Greater Syria in exchange for supporting the British. Of course, they never got this. And those of you who remember the movie Lawrence of Arabia will understand this story. The Balfour Declaration was also another aspect of this period, issued by the British government during World War I. declaring support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Now, World War II. During World War II, the imperial forces had been quite drained, so they had to depart and reduce the imperialistic sort of ambitions in that part of the world. And so what happened? Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and others in the Arabian Peninsula kept their boundaries. Several countries, 7 of them got independence, like Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, Israel. And the UK forces withdrew from Palestine. And the struggle between the Arabs and Jews escalated. I'll very briefly talk about these wars between the Arabs in the region and Israel. First was in 1948. Something else also happened during this period. There was Arab nationalism and revolution in some of the newly independent Middle Eastern countries, which led to a very anti-Western mood. Regimes like Nasser in Egypt, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Assad in Syria, and they were also courted by the Soviet Union. And there was this Cold War, of course, between the Soviet Union and the West. And these countries were, like, in a way, pawns in that war as well, in that game as well. In 1967, you had the 6-day Arab-Israeli War. The Israelis took over Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, West Bank, Jordan River. It was a big blow to the Arabs. And then in 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, the Sinai was given back to Egypt, and the Camp David Accord was signed in 1979 that led to peace between Egypt and Israel and Jordan as well. The Iraqi wars will be in your memory, not too distant memory. They started in 1980 with the Iraqis trying to take over the oil-rich lands of Kazakhstan and the East Bank of the Shah al-Arab in Iran. It was a terrible war. Lots of people died, and there was a complete stalemate. And then, of course, Saddam Hussein launches his famous invasion of Kuwait, resulting in the first Gulf War, and the Western coalition came and evicted the Iraqis from Kuwait. And then the second Gulf War in 2003, when the Western powers led by the US invaded Iraq on the grounds that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be not true. And of course, it led to a complete destabilization of the country, which still to some extent continues. I want to quickly talk about the Arab Spring because it's a bit of a milestone in the history of that region. And was a series of pro-democratic democracy uprisings that started in the spring of 2011 and enveloped MENA countries, namely Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, Egypt, and Bahrain. It was sparked by a street vendor who immolated himself, and that led to the overthrow of the regime of Ben Ali in Tunisia. But he also led in Egypt to the overthrow of President Hosni Mubarak, and then the controversial election of Muhammad Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then the subsequent renewal by President al-Sisi in 2013. In Libya, it led to the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi in 2011, and then the current civil war that still continues. And in Syria, it led to the attempted overthrow. They didn't succeed. An attempted overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, and of course, the ensuing Syrian civil war, which still continues. Now, what are the causes of the Arab Spring? A number of causes. Regimes were authoritative, dictatorial, economic mismanagement happened, cronyism happened, corruption, high unemployment among the youths, and also the role played by social media. And Al Jazeera Arab News Service played a major role as well. The Syrian civil war still continues. You read the papers about it sometimes as what's happening, but it's a bit of a stalemate. And as you can see from this diagram, the forces of President Bashar al-Assad controlled most of the territory, the red area. The yellow area is a Syrian Democratic Front, democratic forces, and then you have some elements of the Islamic Front, the Al-Nusra Front. So this is still an issue, but it appears quite clear that Bashar al-Assad is here to stay. Then another sad story is the Yemeni civil war, which still continues. It's an ongoing conflict, number of factions. The incumbent, the former Yemeni government led by President Mansour Hadi, then the Houthi militia, which is supposed to be supported by Iran. It is an interesting organization because they're largely of the Zaidi sect, which make up 42% of the Muslims in Yemen. The Zaidis are a Shia sect, but very close to the Hanafi Sunni Muslims in Yemen. And then you have the remnants of Al-Qaeda and the former Ansar al-Sharia, who have small areas. And of course, the Southern Transitional Government, which is supported by the UAE with the base in Aden, that has ambitions of forming a separate state in the southern part. The Iranian conflict is like, some people call it the Middle East Cold War, because you have Iran and its proxies, vis-a-vis Saudi, UAE, and some of the Gulf countries. And of course, the key proxies of Iran, the Hezbollah movement, the Shiite Hezbollah movement in Lebanon, led by Hassan Nasrallah, the Bahraini opposition, composed largely of Shia, population of Bahrain, the majority of people in Bahrain are Shia, and of course the Houthi-controlled Supreme Political Council in Yemen. So Iran has a good relationship and a strong relationship with Iraq because majority of people in Iraq are actually Shiites. And Iraq gets support. Iran gets a lot of support from Russia as well, and China is like in between the two. They're good friends between both the Gulf countries and Iran, and the US, of course, a major supporter of the Gulf countries. Now, I want to briefly give you a broad brush approach to ethnicity in the Middle East. And ethnicity in the Middle East is not straightforward. It's not homogeneous. There are 4 ethnic groups in the Middle East. The biggest are the Arabs, 430 million of Arabs. Not all Arabs are Muslims, by the way. There are Christian Arabs in Lebanon, in Egypt. The Coptic Egyptians are Christians. In Palestine, they're Christians. In Jordan, they're Christians. Of course, the majority are Muslims. Arabic is the lingua franca of the Arab world. And modern standard Arabic is used in writing, and formal speech is, of course, in Arabic, but there are different dialects. And because of the Quran, which is written in Arabic, it is an important language for the whole of the 1.8 billion Muslims around the world. The Turkish are an entirely different ethnic group, and it'll be very insulting if you call the Turkish an Arab, because he will say, look, you're Turkish, you're not Arabs. And so you have to understand the different ethnic constituents of the Middle East. There are independent ethnic groups, mainly in Turkey, but there are other, the language is spoken in other countries in northern Cyprus, Bulgaria, Azerbaijan, Bosnia, Kosovo. They were all part of the Ottoman Empire before. The old Ottoman script has been replaced by Kemal Atatürk with a Latin-based Turkish alphabet. Then you have the Kurdish. A lot of people hear about the Kurdish because they're involved in various skirmishes sometimes, but in various regions where they have to fight for their existence sometimes. Okay, so there are basically 35 to 45 million Kurds. Turkey, they are in Iraq, parts of Iran, parts of Syria. There are different distinctive community in terms of race, culture, and language. They are all largely Sunnis, but they are very proud of their identity. And they were supposed to get their own state after World War I. There was a provision for it in the Treaty of Sevres, but it was never implemented. And it's a big source of grievance to the Kurds until the current time, where they feel very badly off because they don't have a homeland. The Persians are the largest ethnic group in Iran, 61% of the population. They've contributed significantly to arts and science, rich culture, history, and there are many Persian-speaking people outside Iran. And they have a modern Persian script, which is a variant of the Arabic script. Now, among the Arabs too, you have different, you could say, broad areas among the Arabs. You have the Iraqi Arabs. They're very proud of they may be they may be not as wealthy as the Gulf Arabs, but they're very proud of their ancient history. Right? Iraq has the second largest population of Arabs. And then you've got the Egyptian Arabs, again, very proud of their ancient history, the pre-Islamic, pharaonic past, and the antiquity of their civilization. And they were pioneers in Arab nationalism, and they have the largest Arabic population. So these are large groups of Arab communities in countries which are having difficulties, but they're very proud people, very proud of their background. Then you have the Europeanized Arabs, largely those who live in the Eastern Mediterranean, who have their ancestry from the ancient Phoenicians, the great traders, the great seafarers, and they were influenced by Hellenistic European culture, starting from Alexander the Great. Then you have the Bedouins. They were traditionally nomadic people who inhabited the desert regions of North Africa and Arabia, divided into tribes. They had a common culture of herding camels, goats, trading livestock. In the early days, they would raid each other tribes. They had no written tradition, but very strong oral tradition, very good in poetry, oral tradition. They had very good memory, and they could read poetry and memorize poetry. Patriarchal society, but they had some traditions of trading in Mecca, in Yemen, agriculture in Medina. But the discovery of oil changed the dynamics of the whole Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East, because the Bedouins developed tremendous wealth and economic clout. All right, now I want to go over the religious denominations, the Muslim denominations, basically, that you often come across, so you understand a little bit about what they mean. Sunnis, for example, the largest group of Muslims are Sunnis, 80%. And it originates from the word Sunnah, which is the body of traditional, social, legal custom practices of the Islamic community. And the teachings are enshrined in the Quran and the Hadith. The Sunnis believe the Prophet Muhammad did not specifically appoint a successor to lead the Ummah, or the community, after his death. And so these are the basic beliefs. Of course, I'm summarizing everything very briefly. They also have various schools of jurisprudence. There are 4 of them. Some people make it 6, but the majority recognize these 4. The Hanifi, the Maliki, the Shafi'i, the Hanbalis. The Shafi'is are mainly the Indonesian Muslims, Malaysian Muslims, a lot of Hanafis in South Asia. And let me now explain about the Salafists. You would have heard of the term Salafism, Salafists. This was a kind of a reform and revivalist movement within Sunni Islam, developed in Egypt in late 19th century. Its roots are in 18th century Wahhabism that originated in Saudi, and they advocate a return to the traditions of the Salaf, the first 3 generations of Muslims that include the generations of the Prophet and his companions, the Sahaba, as they're called. They reject religious innovation. They're Puritans, very puritanical in their interpretation. They reject religious innovation of Bid'ah, and they support, of course, the implementation of the Sharia. Then you have the Wahhabis. You've heard of Wahhabism, a lot of people hear about it, founded by Abdul al-Wahhab in Najd, advocated purging practices of Sunni Islam that referred to veneration of saints, visiting shrines, etc. But they formed a pact with a local leader, Muhammad bin Saud, that became ultimately the ruler of Saudi Arabia, and they have a very strong relationship with his family. The discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia further enhanced the influence of the Al Saud ruling family and the international influence of Wahhabism. It led to a lot of madrasas being built all over the world internationally, mosques being built, universities, public houses, scholarships that spread Wahhabism ideology amongst the global Sunni community. The Shias are the other branch of Muslims, about 15-20%. Shia means adherents of Ali, who is perceived by them as divinely appointed by the Prophet. They believe in the Imamah doctrine, that religious leaders known as Imams are rightfully the central figures of the Ummah. 85% of the Shiites are Twelvers, who believe in 12 of these Imams. And during the Battle of Karbala in 1680 AD, Hussein, and was a son of Ali, and his sons and his followers were martyred by Yazid, the other side. And this was the main trigger point for the chasm between the Shiites and Sunnis. And this martyrdom is very much remembered by commemorated by the Shiites during the day of Asura on the 10th day of Muharram. Here you have a distribution of the two main broad communities in terms of Shia and Sunnis. Now, the Sufis are a mystical group of a mystical expression of Islam. It represents an inward dimension of the religion. The different orders of Sufis, both in Sunni and Shia Islam, they have their own values, rituals, practices, doctrines, institutions, come under the authority of the spiritual leader called Wali. And some of the great Sunni saints include the saint Rumi, who was buried in Konya, or Khayyam was a Sufi. And it's like a universal philosophy of Islam. Anybody can follow. It's very universal, based on spiritual expression, philosophy, love. The Muslim Brotherhood is another interesting organization that is transnational. It's a Sunni Islamic organization founded in Egypt by Islamic scholar Hassan al-Banna in 1928. They advocate introduction of Sharia law as the basis of controlling the affairs of the state and society. They have a big influence over Hamas, Islamist movements in Turkey, and form the underpinning of the Arab Spring. And the Brotherhood is branded as a terrorist organization by Egypt and other countries in the Gulf, but have the backing of Turkey and Qatar. I want to briefly talk about two countries. I can't talk about all the countries, but I've chosen two countries which are important to Singapore because we do a lot of business with them, and they do a lot of business with us. UAE. The UAE is Singapore's most important trading and investment partner in the Middle East. We even have a comprehensive partnership which we have signed with them last year. It's a federation of 7 emirates, became independent in 1971, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Ajman, and 9.7 million population, but of which 15% are Emiratis. The president and vice president run the Supreme Council. The president is the ruler of Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Khalifa, and the vice president is the prime minister, and the prime minister is the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Mohammed. This is always a requirement in the constitution. The remaining rulers sit in the Federal Supreme Council. It is the most diversified economy with oil and gas only comprising 30% of the economy. Abu Dhabi is where the oil and gas is, and Dubai is where the services are. And then of course, they have challenges that they are now coping with, like oil prices, which have led to reduction in expenditure and introduction of VAT. So growth rate is down now, but its growth rate is down all over the world. The World Expo was supposed to be held this year, will be held in Dubai next year in October. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, very important because it is the biggest economy in the GCC, huge producer of oil. It's got the second largest proven petroleum reserves in the world, 1/5 of global reserves, and also a 5th largest reserve of natural gas. It's very oil dependent in terms of earnings for budget and for export earnings. They too are having some difficulties caused by oil prices coming down and general global recession as we see now because of COVID. But it is an important economy, a very large economy opening up to the rest of the world, largely due to the ambitions of the current Crown Prince, Sheikh Mohammed bin Salman, who's got a Vision 2030 agenda to embark on economic and social reforms. When it comes to economic connectivity with Singapore and the region, these are the main areas of connectivity: oil and gas. Saudi is the largest exporter of oil to Singapore, followed by UAE. Qatar is the biggest gas supplier to Singapore and to the Asia-Pac region. They're also now building refining capacity, these Gulf countries, in this region. Infrastructure. There is tremendous infrastructure and construction going on in that part of the world. And that means opportunities for companies in the infrastructure industry or sector in Singapore, but also China and Korea and other countries that are strong infrastructure. And we in Singapore should capitalize on this. Services. Many Singapore companies have already been very successful in services in the UAE and the region. Healthcare, education, project management, town planning, property management, financial services. Now, corporate activity, I want to talk a little bit about this because the UAE Singapore Business Council encapsulates this corporate activity. We have large UAE companies that are active in Singapore, Horizon Terminals, and they run an oil tank farm in Jurong Island, Anata, ground handling and airport managed traffic, airport ground services in the airport, Buruj, one of the biggest petrochemical companies, joint venture with ADNOR. They have global trading operations, marketing operations in Singapore. Enoch, you know Moez, he represents Enoch. Their trading business for the whole of Enoch is centered out of Singapore. IFCO, one of the biggest F&B companies from the UAE that's here. Emirates Airlines, you know about. Now, Global Foundries is the biggest investor from the GCC and from the Middle East into Singapore. They bought Charter Semiconductors, and they have over $5 billion worth of investments here. Alpha Tame Group, they bought Robinsons. Now they're divesting Robinsons, but they own several other companies like Marks and Spencers and so on and so forth. The banks, Abu Dhabi Bank, First Abu Dhabi Bank, Emirates NBD, and then Singapore companies like DP Architects, Abana Jurong, ST Engineering, Ascot, Indoguna, Ola Pico, Minot, Bank of Singapore, DBS. They're all active in the GCC, particularly in UAE. All right. Now, challenges. I'm going to go over this very quickly. Maybe we can talk about it later on. Every country in the world has challenges. Every region has challenges, and so does the whole of the Middle East. So, don't get too sort of deterred by these challenges. What are the challenges? Economically, oil prices. I talked about that. Economic diversification requirements, demographics, high youth employment, dependence in certain countries on foreigners for the economy to sustain. Political, we talked about that earlier. Issues relating to Syria, Yemen, some instability. There are some differences between the GCC, between Qatar and some of the countries. And of course, always intervention by foreign players, Turkey, Russia, etc., US. Some issues on governance in some countries, sectarianism, the issue of Arab-Israeli conflict, authoritarianism. Now, these are universal challenges, all right? So I don't want you to get the impression that this is only unique to the Middle East. But don't forget, within the Middle East, there are some countries like Iraq, a lot of problems there, Syria, a lot of problems. But then there are regions like the GCC, which is very safe, stable, tremendous amount of economic opportunities for Singapore companies. All right, that's where we do most of our business in the GCC. The Sunni-Shia divide, not a big deal, but some of the challenges, I talked about it earlier on. I want to quickly talk about the Arab community in Singapore because it's not, I think, complete for me to finish this off without saying that the Singapore Arab community have been here since 1819, the time Singapore was founded. There are only about 10,000 Singaporean Arabs, but they have a very long history. The Al-Sagaf family, the Al-Kaf family, Al-Talib family, Al-Atas family, they built the Raffles Hotel, the original arcade building in Raffles Place. They mainly came from the Hadramaut region in Yemen, and they are very good traders. At one time, they owned a lot of land in Singapore. Many roads are named after them. And so that really is the conclusion of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions, and I hope you found it interesting. Thank you. Any questions?
Dr. Brian, thank you for the very interesting presentation. It has indeed given us a comprehensive view of the Middle East. And now we would like to open the session for questions. As mentioned earlier, if you have a question, please click on the raise hand icon on your Zoom screen. When it's time to ask a question, our admin will be in touch with you and will then activate you as a panelist, and we will then prompt you to turn on your video and audio so that everyone can see you while you ask your question. You may also choose to type your question into the chat window if you prefer not to be visible. If you have any technical issues, you can chat with our admin in the Zoom chat window. Okay. Looks like we have our first question, and this is from Mr. Leonard Thangavelu, who is from Abu Dhabi Chamber, IRO, Singapore. Leonard, please.
Hi, Brian, excellent talk. I wish I had you as my history teacher. Unfortunately, I wasn't blessed with it. And very informative. Brian, a question that I wanted to ask, it's a question that I'm asked very often, representing the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. It's about the role women play in the Middle East. I think there's a lot of misconception, and I couldn't find a better platform that's not political, but maybe if you could share some light on this with us as well.
Thank you, Leonard. It's a very good question. There are various shades of the role of women in societies of the Middle East, or countries, various countries. I think two countries that stand out where women are doing extremely well is Tunisia and the UAE. In Tunisia, 31% of the parliamentarians are women. 25% of the labor force is women. And it is quite early among the Middle Eastern countries. It's really started off in this business of gender equality and diversity earlier than most countries. The UAE is the other. UAE is really quite amazing in the sense that if you look at this mission to Mars that happened recently, the head of that mission was a lady. And 34% of the people working in that mission to Mars project were actually ladies. It is quite amazing. The story doesn't stop there. Women have a high literacy rate in the UAE, about 95% literacy rate. If you look at the graduates in the UAE, because I know the UAE better in terms of statistics, 70% of all UAE graduates are women. And I have worked with my colleagues, Emirati ladies in my bank. Very, very impressive. Very, very impressive. Very confident. And you'll be surprised, you might think they've gone overseas to a foreign university, and that's why they are so confident. Not true. They have in fact, all the people I know who are very impressive ladies who I've come across in my course, my work in the UAE, are all educated in the UAE. In the UAE. Very hardworking, very sharp, and very impressive. So yes, there are some countries which are behind. You would have read about how things are changing in Saudi now. Women are now being allowed to drive, etc., and getting more involved in the workplace. So yes, there are different degrees of women participation in the economy and sort of, you could say, equal rights. But I must say that these two countries stand out. But let's talk about the world. As you know, is not a level playing field for women across the world. All right, it is not just a phenomena that affects the Middle East, but even Asia, in America, it's not a level playing field for women. But I would say in the Middle East, there's tremendous scope for women, particularly in the countries that I mentioned, and also increasingly in other countries which are moving up the scale. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much, Brian.
All right, Dr. Brian, there is another question that we have from Mr. Bharat Epur. Mr. Bharat have asked if you could say a few words about the ancient and current linkages between India and the Middle East.
Bharat, my good friend from India, I'm glad you found the time to join us in this. Yes, there are definitely ancient connectivity between the region. As I said, the Middle East was really at a crossroads between East and West. Now, I'll give you examples of this. I talked about the Hadramats. The Hadramats are from the province of, the Hadramis are from the Hadramat region of southern Yemen. The Hadramats were very involved in the trade flows between that region of Yemen and India. And so you have also Arabs in India, and they are Hadramis too, from the Hadramat region. And what happened during that period is they were involved in the frankincense trail. And what they would do, they would mine the frankincense in Dhofar. They would move in camel caravans along the western Arabian Peninsula all the way to Petra, and then from Petra they would bifurcate. One group would go to Samaria and trade there, and then the other group would go to Egypt. That's how ancient they were, these Hadrami traders from that region of southern Yemen. And when they had boats, they then would use their boats to navigate and bring the trade, the goods to the Mediterranean. And they did the same to India. The best frankincense in the world comes from that part of the world. And you know, frankincense is used in religious ceremonies in both Egypt, India, and Samaria. Of course, Indian civilization is as ancient as any of the Middle Eastern civilizations. And so there was trade going on there. Just give me an example of frankincense. And subsequently as well, there was trade between the Arabs during the time of, even during the time of the various caliphates, the Umayyads and the Abbasids. There was continuous trade. And during the time of Harun al-Rashid, many Indian scholars were invited. You know, the Arabic numeral, everybody thinks is Arabic, but actually originated from India. The Arabic numeral came from India, but it was, packaged and sold to the West because of the Middle East. Because what happened was all these discoveries and all this knowledge of the East, thanks to people like Harun al-Rashid, was kept in the Middle East, translated into different languages, and then disseminated the whole of Europe. So the Arabs played that role, which a lot of people sometimes forget, of being a bridge between East and West. And even in the ancient times, in terms of cultural and religious influence, there was Indian influence in that part of the world. Pre-Islamic, I'm talking about, in terms of the culture, some of the practices. I hope I answered the question, Bharat. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bharat. Dr. Brian, next we have Mr. Sundaraj Balakrishnan, who will be asking his question via video.
Sure.
Okay, we may have a slight technical glitch. We will move on to the...
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, how are you? Good show.
Good, my brother.
Yeah, good talk, Brian. Really fantastic. Enjoyed it very much. My question is pertaining to generally the supply chain and logistics industry in the Middle East. UAE is the center for logistics. It's been Jebel Ali is a major port and is a major redistribution point for imports and exports out of the UAE. Now, is it still going to carry on being a strong industry in the Middle East, and is that a growth area still in the Middle East for logistics?
Well, thanks for the question. I believe it definitely will carry on, and I think there will be some reconfiguration, as you know, in the supply chain that we have pre-COVID to a new supply chain structure post-COVID. And this concept of near sourcing and on-sourcing is going to change supply chain configurations. And I think Dubai will benefit from it because Dubai is the most connected in the Middle East as far as supply chain is concerned, as you know, as you work there. And the infrastructure is there in terms of port, in terms of telecommunications, in terms of airport connectivity. Thanks to Emirates Airlines, the connectivity in terms of airport air cargo is second to none in that part of the world as far as the UAE is concerned. The financial infrastructure in terms of banks are all there. The openness of the UAE in terms of companies from all over the world coming there and establishing the operation, not just in the domestic economy, but the free zones. You may remember there are two sort of aspects of investments into the UAE. You have investments to the free zones, which is for people who want to use UAE as a base for the whole region. And then you've got another sort of set of rules for people who want to invest in terms of selling to the local sort of business economic sort of community, in which case you have to set up a joint venture with a local company outside the free zone. So you have this structure of free zones specialized in certain areas. Jebel Ali, you know, is one of the largest free, in fact, the largest free zone in that part of the world. It's next to the port. It's 20 minutes to the port, Jebel Ali Free Zone, one of the biggest ports in the world. Jebel Ali is a huge port, and also 20 minutes to the airport. So it's so well located. And I think this tremendous advantage that the UAE has, being so diversified, makes it rather unique in that part of the world. I mean, Qatar and Saudi are trying to diversify, but thanks to the structure we have in the UAE, where you have Emirate in terms of Dubai, focusing purely on services, on connectivity, like Singapore in a way. They have manufacturing as well, but they are so services savvy and so connected to the global economy and the regional economy. So if, let's say, you want to do business in Africa, or you want to do business in the Balkans, or you want to do business in Central Asia, actually to set up an operation, supply chain operation in the UAE makes eminent sense. And largely because of this connectivity. And so I'm very optimistic that while Dubai is going through a very difficult period now, I must tell you, because all these places that are globally linked to the global economy, like Singapore, etc., you know, will have a major impact in terms of this this downturn in the global economy and the downturn in terms of trade and connectivity. So Dubai is suffering from that, no doubt, but it has this uncanny ability of quickly bouncing back. And that's what I think will happen in Dubai. But you also don't forget, Dubai is not a country. It is an emirate within a very wealthy country in the form of UAE. So therefore, if there is need for any sort of financial assistance, liquidity, etc., Abu Dhabi, which is big brother in the UAE, you know, will always come in and help out. So I don't see an issue in the UAE. I don't see an issue in the form of Dubai now going through difficulties, because I think the strength of the UAE is that it's got this amazing federation.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you, Balakrishnan. Okay, Dr. Shegar, we have now 3 questions by Mr. Kevin To. Now, the first one would be, how would or how should one thread the sensitivities between Qatar and the UAE, KSA and Bahrain? That's the first question. Then the second question is, if one is to start business in these countries, what would be the best way to go about doing it? And sorry, don't mind me, let me say the last one. Mm-hmm. Also, do we see thawing of such tensions now? Recently read that KSA would be sending a team to the Arabian Gulf Cup in Qatar, which they boycotted last year.
Sorry, repeat the last question again.
Okay. So he was asking whether or not we would be seeing any thawing of such tensions now. And he had recently read that KSA would be sending a team to the Arabian Gulf Cup in Qatar. Apparently, they have boycotted last year.
Yeah. Okay, very good question, and I must say, interesting question, because they're very relevant. Now, the first question about this so-called embargo, yes, if you are in Saudi, Bahrain, and UAE, and you're based there, and you want to do business, for example, with Qatar, you can't. Okay, there is this embargo, you could call it. That's the word they use, embargo. So if you are a Singapore company, if you want to do business with Qatar, for example, you just do it out of Singapore directly with Qatar. So this base, unfortunately, I was talking about it earlier on, using UAE as a base for the region, at the moment excludes Qatar. Okay, so that's clear. Now, KSA, Bahrain, and the UAE are in one group. So there's no problem there. You can do business in all 3 countries. You can have a base in any of the countries. Let's say you're in UAE, you can do business in Bahrain, Oman, and Kuwait, Iraq, anywhere, Saudi, etc. So there's no issue there. Now, this business of how to do business in this region, all right? If you want to sell a product, all right, you can find an agent to sell a product. If you want to set up an investment in the local sense, for selling in the local market, in the regional market, and then you need a joint venture partner. If you want to, for example, sell your product and distribute it yourself, all right, without an agent, yeah, you could do it in any of the free zones. So let's say you're Company X in Singapore, you have a product, and you want to penetrate the whole of that region. You can open a 100% owned company in any of the free zones, and you can distribute it yourself. But you can't distribute within the country. Let's say you want to sell that product into the UAE because of the restrictions, you have to find a local partner. And getting a local partner is not a problem at all. They have structures where the local partner is just a partner in terms of legal structures, but you control the whole company and you control the management. So I'm happy. The Business Council is always available for anyone like Kevin to talk to get more ideas. All right. The thawing of the relationship, I hope and pray, everybody is hoping and praying that this will happen. Because don't forget, there are many people who have relatives and friends in all these countries. And yeah, so everybody is hoping there'll be a thawing of this relationship. There are some tricky issues. I will not underestimate the challenges. The tricky issues are, the role of the Muslim Brotherhood, who are, as you know, based in Qatar, and the role of Turkey as another factor, and what Qatar does in terms of some of the other areas. It's not so easy. Yeah? The thawing can happen, but I'm not very optimistic that it'll be an easy process. I'm sure we all want it to happen. It'll happen and evolve in a certain way. And there are too many imponderables, too many variables to really factor to give you a clear answer as to whether it's going to happen soon or within a realistic time scale, because there's some very deep-rooted issues that I'm afraid are complicated, to put it very simply. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Brian, for answering all the questions. We have now come to the end of another session in the UAESBC Quarterly Talks series, organized by the UAE Singapore Business Council. Please do look out for snapshots and video of the webinar on the UAESBC's website and social media platforms. On behalf of the UAESBC Exco and the Quarterly Talks Secretariat, we would like to thank His Excellency, Salim Amir Al-Shamsi, and everyone here for your kind attention and participation. Everyone, please stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.